Alberta's Economic Development Minister, Tanya Furr, is headed to Asia to promote the agricultural and forestry industries. To chat more about it, along with some big stories from the Legislature this week, is Tyler Dawson, Alberta correspondent with the National Post. Welcome back to BCN, Tyler.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, Tyler, considering what's been happening with China, a trip to Japan and South Korea may be just what the trade doctor ordered for Alberta.
Yeah, so we've got some Alberta ministers going along, some provincial ministers going along from elsewhere, and the federal minister Jim Carr is going as well. So it's a big set of people who are headed out there, and I think a lot of people maybe don't realize just how big of a trade partner of Canada's Japan is. They're our third largest agricultural market. They're an enormous beef market for us, about $230 million in 2018. So this is actually a pretty important trip, I think. Now, and there's a few reasons why I think that's the case beyond just sort of the numbers. Many viewers in Lethbridge, I imagine, will recall the BSE scare, the mad cow disease scare back in the early 2000s. And Japan just sort of finally put an end to some smaller restrictions on that just in recent months. So, not only is there this promotional aspect, but there's probably also, a nice thank you to be said to the Japanese for dropping those restrictions. And they're also going to South Korea, which does as well still have some restrictions on Canadian beef. So I think hopefully we might see a little bit of movement on that. Who knows if it'll get there, but certainly that's part of this as well. Now, people also remember last summer, there was this mysterious canola thing where there was a ban in China. And then there was also this really serious wheat thing where there were genetically modified wheat stalks sort of found on this access road somewhere in southern Alberta that caused this really big sort of agricultural kerfuffle with bans on imports to China and South Korea as well, I believe. Now that's mostly all been resolved, but I think there's probably a little bit of smoothing over still to be done and updating our counterparts over there on these developments. So hopefully we will have a drama-free growing season and harvest this year compared to last year, because when I did a little bit of reporting on it last summer, I mean, people were pretty tense about that. Those are big markets over there for our products, and if the Kenney government can come back with some big news, some little news on any of it, I think that's a pretty good start to their tenure. And as we've talked about before, rural Albertans, farmers, ranchers, big UCP base. So it's good to see, I think, that one of their very first sort of foreign trips as a government is going to be to try and work on some of those issues to expand market access, those kinds of things in those really big trade partners for us.
Tyler, the Alberta carbon tax was repealed and received royal assent, but gas here in Lethbridge is still $1.20 a litre. What is it in Edmonton right now?
Well, I took a look at Gas Buddy a little bit earlier, and it is apparently at its lowest about 94 cents a litre in Edmonton right now. I was out and about the other day, and it had sort of come down below $1.10 to $1.07, $1.04, depending where you were. So I suspect it's cheaper out in the suburbs a little bit, and where I am downtown, I think, is a little bit higher. But prices have gone down, that's for sure. And they should have, in theory, come down about 6 cents because of the repeal. That's more or less 6.5 cents, give or take, I believe, is what that sort of tacked on per liter. So people should see some relief, but maybe as consolation, it could be $1.27.
Now, the federal carbon tax may be kicking in soon. Premier Kenney says he's going to challenge that in court. Explain to our viewers how that would work. Will we actually see a federal carbon tax, or does Ottawa have to wait until the outcome of the courts?
Well, it's a good question. And the direct answer to that is probably that I don't know if we quite know yet. So the federal government has not given a date by which it's going to impose its carbon tax. I think there is a good bet, almost a certain bet that they're going to impose some sort of carbon tax on things like gasoline. What happens with industrial emitters and things like that is a little bit up in the air because the Kenney government has promised a carbon tax for sort of higher level industrial emitters. So what that federal structure is going to look like in Alberta, we don't know. McKenna's office, Federal Environment Minister Catherine McKenna, her office hasn't confirmed when this is going to happen, only sort of that they're working on it. This is in place in several other provinces who did not develop their own carbon taxation or cap and trade, carbon pricing, whatever you want to call it. schemes. So it will likely come into effect. Now, as for the court challenge, what the government is likely to do is what's called a reference case. So the Alberta government will ask Alberta's highest court, which is the Alberta Court of Appeal. They will say, can you take a look at this situation and tell us whether or not it's constitutional? So it sort of sidesteps a little bit having the actual legal battle in some ways. So that's what's happening in Ontario, and that's what happened in Saskatchewan. Now, the Saskatchewan government lost its appeals case recently, and it has decided it's going to appeal that reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada. So the other thing, of course, is that Ontario's case is still ongoing. A ruling has not come out on that just yet. So what the Kenney government is basically waiting for is a sense of which way the winds are blowing on this. If Saskatchewan is lost, if Ontario loses, then they need to take a look at this and go, oh goodness, we need to come up with a really novel constitutional argument here, because the two that were out there and that the UCP, when they weren't in government, sort of backed as third parties in these court cases, if those don't work, the UCP needs to do some pretty quick thinking. Now, if the Ontario case does work, then they can sort of hew a little bit closer to that line, I think. So government lawyers, I imagine, are sort of scrambling as best they can to keep an eye on those two cases and sort of tinker around where they can with constitutional law here to figure out what to do. The Saskatchewan case in particular, I spoke to a law professor some months ago who said, this is not a non-compelling argument, but it is sort of tinkering around the margins of Canadian constitutional law. And the UCP government is not in a super great position on that in some ways. It is a tricky constitutional question. Saskatchewan has lost, but so, I mean, if no federal carbon tax comes in, they don't have to worry about it. It is very likely that will happen, and they're going to have to do some quick thinking on the law.
Tyler, our real answer to prayer is that High Level has finally been receiving some rain lately. About 4,000 residents have been allowed to return to their homes. Premier Kenney has promised to help rebuild in Paddle Prairie. The wildfire outside of High Level, however, is still burning out of control and moving northward.
Yeah, so about half the population, as you said, has gone back. There are still lots of mandatory evacuations up there. The folks who have returned to High Level, they're still on an evacuation alert. Slave Lake, I believe, is still on an 8-hour evacuation alert. So, people still have to be ready to move sort of quite quickly. And it seems like it's a waiting game at this point. The firefighters are doing their best. The rain certainly helped. I just saw actually in the American press that firefighters from Montana are coming up to help. So, everything is, it's going as best it could in a lot of ways. A handful of building structures were lost in Paddle Prairie. I don't believe we know whether or not they were homes yet. And as you said, Kenney has promised to sort of help rebuild. And I'm sure all Albertans are going to come together to help those people. It's a small settlement of only a few hundred people. It's not, Fort McMurray with tens of thousands, but I have no doubt that Albertans are going to have their back when they get home and when they begin that process of rebuilding.
And hopefully more Northern Albertans will receive some financial compensation as well, those who had to evacuate. Premier Kenney announced that there's also a moratorium on supervised injection sites. So Medicine Hat will not be getting one, Red Deer, Calgary won't be getting a second one. Tyler, what will replace them, if anything?
Yeah, so the government has basically promised to do an evaluation of safe injection sites with sort of social impact studies, listen to what the community has to say, and really also, it seems, try and sort of drill down into whether or not they're working. And what that will look like, it's I think quite hard to say. So if you're looking at social impacts, certainly that might be in terms of if you've increased crime around a supervised injection site. That might be whether or not you have difficulties with businesses who are unhappy and things like that. So they're going to be evaluating all of those things and deciding whether or not they're going to continue. They're planning on continuing to fund the ones that do currently exist. And so whether or not they will fund the new ones down the road is sort of dependent on the outcome of those reviews. Now, there are perhaps some innovative ways that municipalities could overcome this if they so desired. So something similar happened in Ontario after Doug Ford won, and funding was suspended for injection sites in Ottawa. And the city of Ottawa said, well, these have federal government approval, the exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, so we will step in and provide this funding for it. So I think if you have a municipality that is keen on this sort of thing, you may be able to find a way to actually open it and keep funding it. But at this point, what that's going to mean is a review to decide whether or not the government wants to go forward with these.
A bill to allow municipal councils to cut business taxes was introduced recently. Now, will this help bring more business to some of the abandoned and vacant areas of various Alberta cities?
That is certainly the theory. So the idea is that if you are a business looking to start up, you can now look at Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, wherever, and discuss with council. And council could say, look, if you bring your business here, you will not have to pay your municipal tax for 15 years. So you have 15 sort of tax-free-ish years. The bill will come due eventually, but perhaps by then you will be, well seated and turning a profit, and you can pay those taxes then. So, it's part of this larger plan to make Alberta a little bit lower tax, more business friendly. We're seeing that with the cut of the corporate tax from 12% down to 8% over the next few years here. And I think it's helpful to look back at the bids for the new Amazon headquarters. That was, everyone was in a frenzy about that about a year ago, and municipalities were pitching Amazon and saying, come to Ottawa, come to Calgary, wherever, we'd love to have you. And they were competing against American cities that had all these powers to offer tax relief, offer subsidies, and all these sorts of things. Now, one can quibble over whether or not you should be sort of sucking up to big business in some ways to bring them to your city, certainly. But if a city wants to make this decision, if they want to compete with other cities that are able to offer these incentives, shall we say, what this does is it gives them a tool to attract those businesses and start taxing them down the road. So will it work? I mean, certainly one hopes. I think the other thing that cities are going to have to consider here is whether or not they can afford to go without some of these taxes for a period of time. As we're seeing in Calgary, this sort of bizarre financial crunch that council's finding itself in, and governments end up being a little bit stretched when there's a downturn because less taxation is coming in sort of generally. So will anyone do it? I think that that remains to be seen. Will it work? That remains to be seen. But on the face of it, it operates on the same principle as the corporate tax cut. If you lower the difficulty, the threshold for doing business, in theory, business is going to come.
Tyler, the Enbridge Line 3 was held up in court. Who knows if it'll actually even happen now. As for shipping crude by rail, the NDP is still pretty angry that the deal was cancelled and that it may be shifted to private producers. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so this was a policy that the Notley government sort of brought in the dying days of its government. Viewers will remember this big crisis last November, December, when oil was way down and was selling at this huge price differential in the United States. And sort of the reason for that is you had this really big backlog in storage in Alberta, and you didn't have a good way to get it out of the country. And so the solution that the Notley government came up with was, well, we will spend billions of dollars on contracts for locomotives and for cars to ship all this oil. And the Kenney government has not been particularly enthusiastic about that and has promised to cancel it. So the NDP is saying that this is landlocking Alberta's oil again. This is keeping it in the province. There's no way to get it out. And the UCP are saying, well, this is a perfectly legitimate way of doing things. We'll have private rail do it. We'll find other ways to ship it. We can't have grain displaced on rail lines. That's always a big sort of point of contention. So I believe it has been canceled. The NDP is mad about it. What the alternative solution looks like in the end sort of remains to be seen in how well it does work. Now, oil prices have come back up thanks to the other thing that the NDP did, which was curtailment on production. So things have certainly calmed down a little bit. And the other thing that is often forgotten in this debate, I should say, is that these rail cars were not going to be coming online until initially it was late 2019, and then it was sort of moved up to midsummer. But as you mentioned with Enbridge Line 3, that was supposed to be up and running in the next few months here, and that's held up in court. And as you said, who knows? Those court decisions can go either way. They can hold you up for a long time. So, but Kenney's people seem confident that they can get a rail deal done here that's going to make this happen. But it comes back at the end of the day to what everyone has really been saying, is that the only way to really get ourselves out of this crunch is get the TransCanada expansion done. And who knows? They keep saying we're closer and closer to shovels in the ground, but it's really hard to say.
I could just picture right now at the legislature, more desk thumping from the NDP. But hey, let's talk about that desk thumping. The ban is now in place at the Ledge, and the NDP are just what? They're clapping now?
Believe it or not, yeah. So as you said, you're not allowed to pound on your desk, rah, rah, rah anymore. And the NDP just, they can still clap. So that's what they're doing. So, I mean, if the issue was the noise, there's still noise at the legislature. If there was something particularly offensive about table pounding, that's no longer a thing. But MPs, or MLAs, I should say, are free to clap as they will to spur on their leaders. So maybe that's not what the UCP foresaw, but
you know what? I've got an easy solution for this: 2 thumbs up or 2 thumbs down. That's nice and quiet. Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks for joining me once again from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me on.